Lois and I have a running disagreement about how to deal with the parts of the Bible that make us cringe. And there's no shortage of them. Stories like Elisha calling a bear out of the woods to devour some kids just because they were calling him Baldy. I wish that wasn't in there. Images of streets running with blood in the book of Revelation. I wish that wasn't in there either. So there's no shortage of images that make us cringe. But I say, as much as passages like that make me cringe, I say that in order to deal with them honestly, you have to be biblically honest and deal with them as they are. Lois wants to put on theological blinders, stick her fingers in her ears, and chant la, 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 la until they go away. So this morning I'm going to deal with one of those cringeworthy passages. And the more I studied this passage this week, the more I started thinking Lois may have the right idea. I know what Jesus is trying to say in this parable. I just wish he hadn't been so graphic. I mean, look at the details. In our mind's eye, on the one hand, we can see the rich man swathed in his clothes of purple and fine linen, shoveling food into his mouth from a table groaning with delicacies. And then on the other hand, there's this poor man named Lazarus begging at the rich man's gate. And that would be repugnant enough. But Jesus has to tell us Lazarus is so hungry, he would be grateful to eat the scraps that fell from the rich man's table. And then to add insult to injury, we're told that Lazarus' body is covered with running, oozing sores that feral dogs come and lick. Ugh. Just turns your stomach, doesn't it? Well, then both Lazarus and the rich man die, and the scene shifts to the afterlife, which in classic biblical fashion, now the roles are reversed. The word heaven is never used in this passage, but wherever Lazarus is, he's now in much better shape than the rich man who's being tormented by fire in Hades, begging for Lazarus to come and place just one measly drop of water on his tongue to cool his agony, if only for a moment. Ugh. Now, I have to tell you at the outset that Jesus didn't come up with this story on his own. Many ancient cultures told stories very similar to this one. And the writings of the rabbis alone have 7 different versions of this same tale. It also must be said that you're on pretty shaky ground if you try to build a theology of the afterlife from the images in this parable. Nowhere does the Old Testament ever describe the final fate of the wicked as an eternity to be barbecued. Those images crept into Jewish thought mostly through Persian influences, so the images in this story reflect beliefs about the afterlife that were popular in the first century, much like our popular images of a red devil with horns and a tail and an ethereal heaven populated with angels all plucking harps. If you shouldn't build a theology of heaven and hell on those images, then neither should you build a theology on the images in this parable. The images are still there, however, and they still make me cringe. But when I focus on dogs licking sores and fiery eternal torment, I miss what's most cringeworthy of all in this story. I miss the utter injustice done to Lazarus. Think about it. In order to get in and out of his house, the rich man has to step over Lazarus and shoo the dogs away. He has to cover his nose with the sleeve of his expensive tunic in order to block the stench coming from his gate. And we think, has he no heart? Has he no knowledge that the Scriptures tell us to care for the poor? Well, sure he does. But if you read this parable in its context in Luke 16, you'll realize that Jesus is drawing a picture of the rich man to represent the Pharisees with whom he had just been arguing a few verses earlier. For the Pharisees, you see, wealth was a sign of God's favor, and poverty was a sign of God's disfavor. The Pharisees might dole out a shekel here and there to someone like Lazarus so they could go get a Big Mac now and then. But to question the system that kept Lazarus in poverty was tantamount to questioning God. So Jesus told this story so the Pharisees could see themselves in the rich man, swathed in clothes of purple and fine linen, shoveling food into his mouth from a table, groaning with delicacies, while Lazarus begged at his gate. Jesus told the story to drive home the point that God is not pleased when one person eats while another one starves. Penny and I once volunteered to be restaurant raiders for the Let Us Entertain You company. It was great. We ate wonderful meals that we didn't have to pay for, and we got reimbursed for travel. When we finished, a nice lady from the company called to say that they liked our rating so much, they wanted to bump us up to rating their high-end restaurants. And we thought about it, and I finally said, I don't feel right about this. My church feeds a hot, nutritious meal to homeless and underemployed people every Wednesday night for pennies a person. And I'm just uneasy about plunking down $400 to $500 for a meal for two people, even if I am getting reimbursed for it. And I felt pretty good about my fearless stand against injustice until I remembered all the Lazaruses that I've stepped over too. I remember in particular, I was working late at a previous church that I served. It was a cold, rainy afternoon. I was alone in the building. I had a ton of work to do. And then I heard the buzzer at the side door of the building. My office had a window which looked out, and I could see that door. And I looked and I saw a guy who'd been there many, many times before. He would come into my office and sit down and just ramble. What he said never made any sense. If I pressed him for what he was looking for, he might tell me he was looking for a little money, but if I let him go on, he would just talk into next week. He seemed mentally unbalanced to me, and I'm sure he had a tough life, and I tried to be sympathetic, but I looked at him through the window, and I looked at that mountain of work on my desk, and I thought, dear God, why him today? For a moment, I thought, well, maybe he didn't see that I'm in here, and then he looked at me and went, So I got up and opened the door and I said, look, I really don't have the time to talk today. And he said, well, that's okay. And off he went into his ramble. I didn't invite him in. So he stood outside with the cold raindrops soaking his clothes, babbling the same incoherent argument as always, while I stood in the doorway, dry and warm, just wishing he'd go away. Finally, the telephone rang, and I saw my escape route. I got to go, my phone's ringing. He said, well, God bless you, and he turned and walked away into the cold rain. I closed the door, brushed the raindrops off my clothes of purple and fine linen, and went back inside to shovel food into my mouth from a table groaning with delicacies. No, it's too easy to condemn the rich man as a godless materialist. He stepped over Lazarus at his gate just like I too often step over Lazarus at my gate. Jesus didn't want the rich man to help Lazarus because he felt guilty. He wanted him to help Lazarus because he saw the world with new eyes, just like he wanted the Pharisees to see the world with new eyes. For the Pharisees, everything came down to money. Just like, let's face it, it all comes down to money for us. It's not that we don't care. We're just scared. Scared of what will happen if we're not careful with our resources. The rich man didn't wind up in Hades because he had a lot of money. He wound up in Hades because he saw his resources as something to hoard instead of share. When you're afraid, you tend to step over Lazarus as you come and go. Isn't fear the way we're manipulated by the powers of this world? I confess even I am not above utilizing fear when it suits my purposes. I remember one time an IRS agent showed up at my door. And when he showed me his badge, all the blood must have drained out of my face because he immediately said, oh, this isn't about you. And so my heart started again and I started breathing. And he said, no, this is about Bruce Parker. Do you know him? I said, yes, I do. He's a member of my congregation. And the IRS agent said, did he donate $10,000 to the church building fund? I said, he will. That didn't happen. But it does demonstrate the kind of fear that's at the heart of so many of our financial decisions. Contrast that with the story from Jeremiah 32 about God telling the prophet to go buy a field from his cousin. Seems like an odd command from the Lord, especially when verse 2 of the passage tells us at that time the army of the king of Babylon was besieging Jerusalem. Now, why would God tell Jeremiah to buy some real estate when the entire nation was on the verge of collapse from an invading army? Well, the answer is found in verse 15. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, houses and fields and vineyards shall again be bought in this land. In other words, the besieging Babylonian army surrounding Jerusalem was not the last word. God said there was life on the other side of even this dire situation. So there was no reason for despair. There was no reason for fear. What would it look like if you and I worried as much about marking our lives with faith as we do about money? What would it look like if you and I worried as much about filling the world with love as we do about money? What would it look like if we worried as much, if not more, about Lazarus' well-being as we do about protecting our own well-being? What would our giving look like in 2018 if we really saw the world through eyes of faith? Maybe it would look like an experience Tony Campolo had one time. Some of you may remember it. Got off a plane in Philadelphia after a red-eye flight from the West Coast. He was tired and all he wanted to do was go home and go to bed, but his secretary met him at the airport and told him he had a speaking engagement that morning. She said, I don't know how we missed this one, but somehow this engagement fell through the cracks. So I'm taking you directly to the church where you're going to be speaking. It's a World Day of Prayer service, and you're supposed to give a missionary message. Reluctantly, Campolo let her drive him to the church where he took his place behind the pulpit as the service started. He wasn't thinking clearly, but he heard the woman leading the service announce to the crowd they had a request from a missionary in Venezuela, a doctor who had given her life to serving the poor in the barrios of Caracas. And she was asking for $5,000 to put an addition on her medical clinic to better handle the multitudes of sick people who came to her way from the barrios. And after explaining the need, the leader turned and said, Dr. Campolo, would you come and lead us in a prayer that God might provide the $5,000 our sister needs in Venezuela? Well, maybe it was his fatigue, or maybe it was the Holy Spirit working through him, but before he could catch himself, Campolo got up and said, no, I won't pray for $5,000. But what I will do is take all the money I'm carrying right now and put it on the altar. And then I'm going to ask everybody here to do the same thing. No checks, we'll take only cash. And after we put all of the cash that we're carrying on the altar, then we'll count it. And then I'll ask God to make up the difference. He said it was a good day for pulling this off because they only had $2.25 on him. So after he put that paltry sum on the altar, he turned to the service leader and said, now it's your turn. She said, yes, yes. We've all gotten the point, Dr. Campolo. And he said, no, I don't think we have. My $2.25 is on the altar. Now it's your turn. Well, the woman was a bit rattled, but she nevertheless opened her wallet and produced $110 and slapped it down on top of Campolo's meager offering. Campolo said, we're on our way. We have $112.25. And then he pointed to a woman in the front row and said, now it's your turn. She looked around a little embarrassed, but she smiled and walked up to the altar and put down her cash on top of the rest. And then Campolo turned to the next lady and the next and the next and the next. It took more than 25 minutes to take up the offering that day as one by one the worshipers came forward and put their money down. Some of them came smiling, others came with dirty looks, obviously holding back some of the money they had on them. There wasn't time for Campolo to preach. They probably didn't want to hear him preach anyway after that end run. So when everybody had come forward, Campolo counted the money, and there was more than $8,000. And Campolo said, the audacity of asking God for $5,000 when God has already provided us with more than $8,000. We don't need to ask God to supply our needs. God's already done it. What would it look like if you and I worried more about marking our lives with love and faith as we do about money? You tell me.